Twilight of the Idols and the Antichrist by Friedrich Nietzsche. Read by Barnaby Edwards for Naxos Audiobooks. Twilight of the Idols. Preface. It requires no little skill to maintain one's cheerfulness when engaged in a sullen and extremely responsible business, and yet what is more necessary than cheerfulness? Nothing succeeds unless overflowing spirits have a share in it. Only the excess of power is the proof of power, a transvaluation of all values, that question mark, so black, so huge, that it casts a shadow on him who sets it up. Such a doom of a task compels one every moment to run into sunshine, to shake off a seriousness which has become oppressive, far too oppressive. Every expedient is justifiable for that purpose. Every case is a case of fortune. Warfare, more especially. Warfare has always been the grand policy of all minds, which have become too self-absorbed and too profound. There is healing virtue even in being wounded. A saying, the origin of which I withhold from learned curiosity, has for a long time been my motto. The spirits increase, vigour grows through a wound. Another mode of recuperation, which under certain circumstances is still more to my taste, is to sound out idols. There are more idols in the world than realities. That is my evil eye for this world. It is also my evil ear. To put questions here for once with a hammer, and perhaps to hear as an answer that well-known hollow sound which indicates inflation of the bowels. What delight for one who has got ears behind his ears. For me, an old psychologist and rat-catcher, in whose presence precisely that which would like to remain unheard is obliged to become audible. This work also, the title betrays it, is above all a recreation, a sun-freckle, a diversion into the idleness of a psychologist. Is it also, perhaps, a new warfare? And new idols are sounded out, are they? This little work is a grand declaration of warfare, and as regards the sounding out of idols, it is no temporary idols, but eternal idols, which are here touched with a hammer, as with a tuning fork. There are no older, more self-convinced, or more inflated idols in existence. Neither are there any hollower ones. That does not prevent them from being the most believed in. Besides, people never call them idols, least of all in the most eminent case. Turin, the 30th of September, 1888, the day when the first book of the Transvaluation of All Values was finished. Friedrich Nietzsche. Apothegms and Darts. 1. Idleness is the parent of all psychology. What? Is psychology then a vice? 2. Even the boldest of us have but seldom the courage for what we really know. 3. To live alone, one must be an animal or a god, says Aristotle. The third case is lacking. One must be both, a philosopher. 4. Every truth is simple. Is that not doubly a lie? 5. Once and for all, there is much I do not want to know. Wisdom sets bounds even to knowledge. 6. We recover best from our unnaturalness, from our spirituality, in our savage moods. 7. How is it? Is man only God's mistake, or God only man's mistake? 8. From the military school of life, what does not kill me strengthens me. 9. Help yourself, then everyone else helps you. Principle of brotherly love. 10. If only we were guilty of no cowardice with respect to our doings, if only we did not repudiate them afterwards. Remorse of conscience is indecent. 11. Is it possible for an ass to be tragic, for a person to sink under a burden which can neither be carried nor thrown off? The case of the philosopher. 12. When one has one's wherefore of life, one gets along with almost every how. Man does not strive after happiness, only the Englishman does so. 13. Man has created woman. Out of what, do you think? Out of a rib of his God, his ideal. 14. What? You are seeking? You would like to multiply yourself by 10, to multiply yourself by 100? You are seeking followers? Seek nobodies. 15. Posthumous men, myself, for example, are worse understood than opportune men, but they are better listened to. More precisely, we are never understood, hence our authority. 16. Among women. Truth? Oh, you do not know truth. Is it not an outrage on all our shames? 17. That is an artist such as I love, modest in his requirements. He only really wants two things, his bread and his art, panem et circen. 18. He who cannot put his will into things puts at least a meaning into them. That is, he believes there is a will in them already. Principle of belief. 19. What? You choose virtue and a full heart, and at the same time gaze with envy at the advantages of the unscrupulous? With virtue, however, one renounces advantage. At the door of an anti-Semite. 20. The perfect woman perpetrates literature as she perpetrates a little sin, by way of a test, in passing, turning round to look and see if anybody notices it, and in order that somebody may notice it. 21. To get ourselves only into such situations as do not permit us to have feigned virtues, in which, rather like the tightrope dancer on his rope, we either fall or stand, or escape in safety. 22. Bad men have no songs. How is it that the Russians have songs? 23. German esprit. For 18 years, a contradiction in terms. 24. By seeking after the beginnings of things, people have become crabs. The historian looks backwards. He finally believes backwards also. 25. Contentedness is a prophylactic, even against catching cold. Has a woman who knew she was well dressed ever caught cold? I put the case that she was hardly dressed at all. 26. I mistrust all systematizers and avoid them. The will to a system is a lack of rectitude. 27. We think women are deep. Why? Because we never find any bottom in them. Women are not even shallow. 28. If a woman possesses manly virtues, she is to be run away from, and if she does not possess them, she runs away herself. 29. How much the conscience had to bite on formerly, what good teeth it had, and today what is wrong? A dentist's question. 30. We seldom commit a single rash act. The first time we always do too much. Just on that account we are usually guilty of a second rash act, and then we do too little. 31. The trodden-on worm turns itself. That is sagacious. It thereby lessens the probability of being trodden on again. In the language of morality, submissiveness. 32. There is a hatred of lying and dissembling, resulting from a sensitive notion of honor. There is also a similar hatred resulting from cowardice, inasmuch as lying is forbidden by a divine command, too cowardly to tell lies. 33. How little is required for happiness, the sound of a bagpipe. Without music, life would be a mistake. The German even conceives of God as singing songs. 34. One can think and write only when sitting down. Flaubert. There I have you, nihilist. Sedentary application is the very sin against the Holy Ghost. Only thoughts won by walking are valuable. 35. There are times when we psychologists become restive like horses. We see our own shadows before us bobbing up and down. The psychologist, to see it all, has to look away from himself. 36. Whether we immoralists do injury to virtue? Just as little as anarchists do to princes. It is only since princes have been wounded by shots that they sit firmly on their thrones again. Moral, we must wound morality by our shots. 37. You run on ahead? Do you do so as a shepherd or as an exception? A third case would be that of the deserter. First question of conscience. 38. Are you genuine or only a dissembler? A representative or the represented itself? Finally, you are merely an imitation of a dissembler. Second question of conscience. 39. The disillusioned speaks. I sought for great men. I never found anything but the apes of their ideal. 40. Are you one who looks on, or one who goes to work, or one who looks away and turns aside? Third question of conscience. 41. Do you intend to go along with others, or go on ahead, or go by yourself? One must know what one intends, and that one intends something. Fourth question of conscience. 42. Those were steps for me. I have climbed up beyond them. To do so I had to pass over them. But it was thought I would make them my resting place. 43. Of what consequence is it that I am in the right? I am too much in the right, and he who laughs best today will laugh also in the end. 44. Formula of my happiness? A yes, a no, a straight line, a goal. The problem of Socrates. 1. The wisest men in all ages have judged similarly with regard to life. It is good for nothing. Always and everywhere we hear the same sound out of their mouth, a sound full of doubt, full of melancholy, full of the fatigue of life, full of resistance to life. Even Socrates said when he died, "To live, that means to be a long time sick. I owe a cock to Asclepius the Saviour." Even Socrates had enough of it. What does that prove? What does it indicate? Formerly, it would have been said, it has been said indeed, and loud enough and loudest of all by our pessimists, here, at all events, there must be something true. The consensus of the wise proves the truth. Are we still to continue talking in such a manner? Are we allowed to do so? Here, at all events, there must be something diseased, is our answer. Those wisest men of all ages, we should look at them more closely. Were they, perhaps all of them, a little shaky on their legs, belated, tottering, decadent? Does wisdom, perhaps, appear on earth as a raven inspired by a faint scent of carrion? This irreverence, that the great wise men are declining types, first suggested itself to my mind with regard to a case where the strongest prejudices of the learned and the unlearned stood opposed to it. I recognized Socrates and Plato as symptoms of decline, as agencies in Grecian dissolution, as pseudo-Grecian, as anti-Grecian. That consensus of the wise, I understood it better and better, proves least of all that they were correct in that on which they were in accordance. It proves rather that they themselves, those wisest men, were somehow in accordance physiologically to take up a position. To have to take up a position unanimously negative with regard to life. Judgments, valuations with regard to life, for or against, can ultimately never be true. They only possess value as symptoms. They only come into consideration as symptoms. In themselves, such judgments are follies. We must by all means stretch out the hand and attempt to grasp this surprising finesse, that the worth of life cannot be estimated. It cannot be estimated by a living being, because such a one is a party, indeed the very object, in the dispute, and not a judge. It cannot be estimated by a dead person for a different reason. For a philosopher to see a problem in the worth of life is really an objection to him, a mark questioning his wisdom, a folly. What, and all these great wise men? They were not only decadents, they were not even wise. But I come back to the problem of Socrates. Socrates, according to his descent, belonged to the lowest of the people. Socrates was of the mob. One knows, one still sees it oneself, how ugly he was, but ugliness, while it is an objection in itself, is almost a refutation when found among Greeks. Was Socrates Greek at all? Ugliness is often enough the expression of a thwarted development checked by interbreeding. Besides, it appears as a deteriorating development. The anthropologists, who are criminologists, tell us that the typical criminal is ugly, a monster in face, a monster in soul. But the criminal is a decadent. Was Socrates a typical criminal? At least the famous verdict of a physiognomist, which was so offensive to the friends of Socrates, would not contradict that assumption. A foreigner, who was a judge of countenances, when he passed through Athens, told Socrates to his face that he was a monster. He concealed in himself all the worst vices and passions, and Socrates merely answered, "You know me, sir." Not only does the confessed dissoluteness and anarchy in his instincts point to decadence in Socrates, but the superfetation of logicality and that barbed malignity which distinguishes him points in the same direction. Neither must we forget those auditory hallucinations which have wrongly been interpreted in a religious sense, as the demon of Socrates. Everything is exaggerated in him. Everything is buffo and caricature. At the same time, everything is concealed, reserved, and subterranean. I try to understand out of what idiosyncrasy the Socratic equation of reason equals virtue equals happiness originates, that most bizarre of equations, which, in particular, has all the instincts of the older Hellenes opposed to it. With Socrates, Greek taste veers round in favour of dialectics. What really happens then? Above all, superior taste is vanquished. The mob gets the upper hand along with dialectics. Previous to Socrates, dialectic manners were repudiated in good society. They were regarded as improper manners. They compromised. The youths were warned against them. Besides, all such modes of presenting reasons were distrusted. Honest things, like honest men, do not carry their reasons in their hands in such fashion. It is indecent to show all one's goods. That which needs to be proved is of little worth. All the world over, where authority still belongs to accepted usage, where one does not give reasons but commands, the dialectician is a sort of buffoon. He is laughed at, he is not taken seriously. Socrates was the buffoon who got himself taken seriously. What really happened then? We choose dialectics only when we have no other means. We know we inspire mistrust with it. We know it does not carry much conviction. Nothing is more easily wiped away than the effect of a dialectician. That is proved by the experience of every assembly where speeches are made. It can only be a last defense in the hands of those who have no other weapon left. It is necessary to have to extort one's rights, otherwise one makes no use of dialectics. The Jews were therefore dialecticians. Reynard the Fox was a dialectician. What? And Socrates also was one? Is the irony of Socrates an expression of revolt, of a mob-like resentment? Does he, as one of the suppressed, enjoy his natural ferocity in the dagger thrusts of syllogism? Does he revenge himself on the upper classes whom he fascinates? As a dialectician, a person has a merciless instrument in his hand. He can play the tyrant with it. He compromises when he conquers. The dialectician leaves it to his opponent to demonstrate that he is not an idiot. He is made furious and at the same time helpless. The dialectician paralyzes the intellect of his opponent. What? Is dialectics only a form of revenge with Socrates? I have indicated what could make Socrates repellent. There is now the more need to explain the fact that he fascinated, that he discovered a new mode of agon, of which he became the first fencing master for the superior circles of Athens. That is one reason. He fascinated in that he appealed to the agonal instinct of the Hellenes. He introduced a variation into the wrestling matches among young men and youths. Socrates was also a great erotic. But Socrates found out even more. He saw behind the higher class of Athenians. He understood that his case, the idiosyncrasy of his case, was no longer exceptional. The same kind of degeneration was quietly preparing everywhere. Old Athens was coming to an end, and Socrates understood that all the world had need of him, of his method, his cure, his special artifice for self-maintenance. Everywhere the instincts were in anarchy. Everywhere people were within an ace of excess. The monster in animo was the universal danger. The impulses are about to play the tyrant. We must invent a stronger counter-tyrant. When that physiognomist had disclosed to Socrates what he was, a cave of all evil passions, the great ironist uttered another word which gives the key to him. "It is true," he said, "but I became master over them all." How did Socrates become master over himself? His case was, after all, only the extreme case, the most striking case, of that which then began to be the universal trouble, namely that nobody was any longer master of himself, that the instincts became mutually antagonistic. He was fascinating as such an extreme case. His fear-inspiring ugliness proclaimed him as such to every eye. As a matter of course, he was still more fascinating as the answer, the solution, the seeming cure of this case. When it is necessary to make a tyrant out of reason, as Socrates did, there must be considerable danger of something else playing the tyrant. Rationality was hit upon in those days as a saviour, It was not a matter of free choice for either Socrates or his valetudinarians to be rational. It was de rigueur. It was their last expedient. The fanaticism with which the whole of Greek thought throws itself upon rationality betrays a desperate situation. They were in danger. They had only one choice. They had either to go to ruin or be absurdly rational. The moralism of the Greek philosophers from Plato downwards is pathologically conditioned, their estimation of dialectics likewise. Reason equals virtue equals happiness means merely that we have to imitate Socrates and put a permanent daylight in opposition to the obscure desires, the daylight of reason. We have to be rational, clear, and distinct at any price. Every yielding to the instincts, to the unconscious, leads downwards. I have indicated by what means Socrates exercised fascination. He seemed to be a physician, a saviour. Is it necessary to expose the error which was involved in his belief in rationality at any price? It is self-deception on the part of philosophers and moralists to think of rising above decadence by waging war with it. Rising above it is beyond their power. What they select as an expedient, as a deliverance, is itself only an expression of decadence. They alter its expression, they do not do away with the thing itself. Socrates was a misunderstanding. The whole of improving morality, including Christian morality, has been a misunderstanding. The fiercest daylight, rationality at any price, the life clear, cold, prudent, conscious, without instincts, in opposition to instincts. This itself was only an infirmity, another infirmity, and not at all a way of return to virtue, to health, or to happiness. To have to combat the instincts, that is the formula for decadence. As long as life ascends, happiness is identical with instinct. Has he realized that himself, this wisest of all self-deceivers? Did he at the last say that to himself in the wisdom of his courage to meet death? Socrates wanted to die. Athens did not give him the poison cup. He gave it to himself. He compelled Athens to give it to him. Socrates is no physician, he said softly to himself. Death is the only physician here. Socrates himself was just a chronic valetudinarian. Reason in philosophy. 1. People ask me, what is the idiosyncrasy in philosophers? For example, their lack of historical sense, their hatred of the very idea of becoming, their Egyptianism. They think they confer honor on a thing when they isolate it from its historical relations, from the viewpoint of eternity, when they make a mummy out of it. For millennia, philosophers have only been handling conceptual mummies. Nothing real has come out of their hands alive. They kill, they stuff, when they adore these gentlemen, these conceptual idolaters. They become mortally dangerous to everything when they adore. For them, death, change, and age, just as well as production and growth, are objections, refutations even. What is does not become. What becomes is not. Now they all believe in what is, with desperation even. As, however, they do not get hold of what is, they seek for reasons why it is withheld from them. There must be a semblance, a deception there, which prevents us perceiving what it is. Where is the deceiver concealed? We have found it, they cry joyfully. It is sensuousness. Those senses, which are also so immoral in other respects, deceive us with regard to the true world. Moral, to escape from the deception of the senses, from becoming, from history, from falsehood. History is nothing but belief in the senses, belief in falsehood. Moral, denial of all that accords belief to the senses, of all the rest of mankind. That all is mob. To be a philosopher, to be a mummy, to represent monotonous theism by a grave-digger's mimicry, and above all, away with the body, that pitiable idée fixe of the senses, afflicted with all the fallacies of logic in existence, refuted, impossible even, although it is impudent enough to pose as actual. With high reverence, I set the name of Heraclitus apart from the others. If the mob of the other philosophers rejected the testimony of the senses because they exhibited plurality and alteration, he rejected their testimony because they exhibited things as if they possessed permanence and unity. Heraclitus also did injustice to the senses. They neither deceive in the way the Eleatics believed, nor as he believed. They do not deceive at all. What we make out of their testimony is what introduces falsehood. For example, the falsehood of unity, the falsehoods of materiality, of substance, of permanence. Reason is the cause why we falsify the testimony of the senses. In as far as the senses exhibit becoming, dissolving, and transforming, they do not deceive. But Heraclitus will always be right in this, that being is an empty fiction. The seeming world is the only one. The true world has merely been deceitfully invented. And what fine instruments for observation we possess in our senses. This nose, for example, of which as yet no philosopher has spoken with respect and gratitude, is even, in the meantime at least, the most delicate instrument at our disposal. It is able to detect minimum differences of movement which even the spectroscope cannot detect. At present we possess science exactly to the extent that we have resolved to accept the testimony of the senses, to the extent that we have learned to sharpen them, furnish them with appliances, and follow them mentally to their limits. The rest is abortion and not yet science, i.e. metaphysics, divinity, psychology, and theory of perception. Or formal science, science of symbols as logic and that applied form of logic, mathematics. Reality is nowhere mentioned in those sciences, not even as a problem, as little as is the question, what value such a symbolic convention as logic possesses at all. The other idiosyncrasy of philosophers is not less dangerous. It consists in confounding the last and the first. The products which occur at the end, alas, for they should not occur at all, the highest notions, that is, the most general, the emptiest notions, the last fumes of evaporating reality, are placed by them at the beginning, as the beginning. This, again, is only the expression of their way of doing reverence. The higher must not grow out of the lower, it must not be grown at all. Moral. Everything of the first rank must be the cause of itself. The origin out of something else is regarded as an objection, as a sign of questionable value. All highest values are of the first rank. None of the highest notions, the notions of what is, of the unconditioned, of the true, of the perfect, none of all these can have become. Each must, consequently, be causa sui. But none of those highest notions can be unequal either. They cannot be in disagreement among themselves. They thereby attain their stupendous conception of God. The last, the thinnest, the emptiest is placed as the first, as cause in itself, as the most real being. Alas, that mankind should have taken seriously the delirium of sick cobweb spinners, and they have paid dearly for it. Let us finally state, in opposition to this, how differently we, I say we courteously, view the problem of error and appearance. Formerly, people regarded alteration, mutation, and becoming, generally, as evidence of appearance, as indications that there could only be something there which led them astray. At present, on the contrary, we see ourselves entangled in some measure in error, necessitated to error, precisely as far as our rational prejudice compels us to posit unity, identity, permanence, substance, cause, materiality, what is. However certain we are, by means of a strict recalculation of the account, that the error is found there. It is just the same here as with the motions of the sun. There our eyes are the agencies through which error constantly operates. Here it is our language. In its origin, language belongs to the age of the most rudimentary form of psychology. We come into the midst of a rude fetish system when we call up into consciousness the fundamental presuppositions of linguistic metaphysics, i.e., the presuppositions of reason. This system sees actors and action everywhere. It believes in will as cause in general. It believes in the ego as being, in the ego as substance, and it projects the belief in the ego substance onto everything. It first creates from this the conception thing. Being is everywhere thought into and foisted upon things as cause. It is only from the conception ego that the derivative conception of being follows. At the commencement, there is the great bane of error, that will is something which acts, that will is a faculty. We now know that it is merely a word. Very much later, in a world 1,000 times better enlightened, the certainty, the subjective assurance in handling the categories of reason came all of a sudden to the consciousness of philosophers. They concluded that those categories could not have their origin in experience, for the whole of experience, they said, was in opposition to them. Consequently, where do they originate from? And in India, as in Greece, the same mistake has been fallen into. We must once have belonged to a higher world, instead of one very much lower, which would have been the truth. We must have been divine, for we possess reason. In fact, nothing has hitherto had a more naive, convincing power than the error of being, as it was formulated, for example, by the Eleatics, for it has in its favour every word, every sentence we utter. The opponents of the Eleatics likewise yielded to the misleading influence of their concept of being. Democritus, among others, when he devised his atom. Reason in language, oh, what a deceitful old female! I fear we do not get rid of God, because we still believe in grammar. People will be thankful if I compress such an essential and such a new insight into 4 theses. I will thereby make it more easily understood. I will thereby challenge contradiction. First proposition. The grounds upon which this world has been designated as apparent rather establish its reality. Another kind of reality cannot possibly be established. Second proposition. The characteristics which have been assigned to the true being of things are the characteristics of non-being, of nothingness. The true world has been built up out of the contradiction to the actual world, an apparent world in fact, in as far as it is merely an illusion of moral optics. Third proposition. To talk about another world than this has no meaning at all, unless an instinct of slander, disparagement, and aspersion of life is powerful in us. If that be the case, we take revenge on life with the phantasmagoria of another, a better life. Fourth proposition. To separate existence into a true and an apparent world, either in the manner of Christianity or in the manner of Kant, who was a wily Christian after all, is only a suggestion of decadence, a symptom of deteriorating life. That the artist values appearance more than reality is no objection against this proposition, for here appearance means reality once more, only selected, strengthened, and corrected reality. The tragic artist is no pessimist. He rather says yes, even to all that is questionable and formidable. He is Dionysian. How the true world finally became a fable. History of an Error. 1. The true world attainable by the wise, the pious, and the virtuous man, he lives in it, he embodies it. Oldest form of the idea, relatively rational, simple, and convincing. Transcription of the proposition, I, Plato, am the truth. 2. The true world unattainable at present, but promised to the wise, the pious, and the virtuous man, to the sinner who repents. Progress of the idea. It becomes more refined, more insidious, more incomprehensible. It becomes feminine. It becomes Christian. 3. The true world, unattainable, undemonstrable, and unable to be promised, but even as conceived, a comfort, an obligation, and an imperative. The old sun still, but shining only through mist and skepticism. The idea becomes sublime, pale, northerly, Kernisbergian. 4. The true world, unattainable, at any rate unattained, and being unattained also unknown, consequently also neither comforting, saving, nor obligatory. What obligation could anything unknown lay upon us? Grey morning, first yawnings of reason, cock-crowing of positivism. 5. The true world, an idea neither good for anything, nor even obligatory any longer. An idea which has become useless and superfluous, consequently a refuted idea. Let us do away with it. Full day, breakfast, return of good sense and cheerfulness, Plato blushing for shame, infernal noise of all free intellects. 6. We have done away with the true world. What world is left? Perhaps the apparent. But no, in doing away with the true, we have also done away with the apparent world. Noon. The moment of the shortest shadow, end of the longest era, climax of mankind. Zarathustra begins. Morality as anti-nature. 1. All passions have a time when they are merely fatal, when, with the weight of their folly, they drag their victim down, and they have a later, very much later, period, when they are wedded with the spirit, when they are spiritualized. Formerly, people waged war against passion itself, on account of the folly involved in it. They conspired for its annihilation. All old morality monsters are unanimous on this point. The passions must be killed. The most notable formula for that view stands in the New Testament, in the Sermon on the Mount, where, let us say in passing, things are not at all regarded from an elevated point of view. For example, there it is said, with application to sexuality, if thine eye offend thee, pluck it out. Fortunately, no Christian acts according to this precept. To annihilate passions and desires merely in order to avoid their folly and its unpleasant results appears to us at present simply as an acute form of folly. We no longer admire the dentist who pulls out the teeth so that they may no longer cause pain. It may be acknowledged, on the other hand, with some reasonableness, that on the soil out of which Christianity has grown, the notion of a spiritualization of passion could not possibly be conceived. The primitive church, as is well known, battled against the intelligent in favor of the poor in spirit. How could we expect from it an intelligent war against passion? The Church fights against passion with excision in every sense. Its practice, its cure, is castration. It never asks how to spiritualize, beautify, and deify a desire. It has, at all times, laid the emphasis of discipline upon extermination, of sensuality, of pride, of ambition, of avarice, of revenge. But to attack the passions at the root means to attack life itself at the root, and the practice of the Church is inimical to life. The same means, castration, extirpation, is instinctively chosen in the struggle with a desire by those who are too weak of will and too degenerate to be able to impose due moderation upon themselves. Those natures which, to speak with a simile, and without a simile, need la trappe. Any definitive declaration of hostility, a gap between themselves and a passion. The radical means are indispensable only to the degenerate. Weakness of will, or, to speak more definitely, the incapability of not reacting in response to a stimulus, is itself merely another form of degeneration. Radical hostility, deadly hostility against sensuality, is always a critical symptom. One is thereby justified in making conjectures with regard to the general condition of such an extremist. Moreover, that hostility, that hatred, only reaches its height when such natures no longer possess sufficient strength for a radical cure, for renouncing their devil. Survey the whole history of priests and philosophers, that of artists also included, and you will see the most virulent attacks on the senses are not made by the impotent, nor by ascetics, but by impossible ascetics, those who needed an ascetic life. The spiritualization of sensuousness is called love. It is a grand triumph over Christianity. Our spiritualization of hostility is another triumph. It consists in profoundly understanding the importance of having enemies. In short, in acting and reasoning the reverse of the former acting and reasoning. The Church always wanted to exterminate its enemies. We, the immoralists and anti-Christians, see our advantage in the existence of the Church. In political matters also, hostility has now become more spiritualized, much more prudent, much more critical, much more forbearing. Almost every party conceives that it is advantageous for its self-maintenance if the opposite party does not lose its power. The same is true of grand politics. A new creation especially, e.g., the new empire has more need of enemies than of friends. It is only in opposition that it feels itself indispensable, that it becomes indispensable. In the same way do we conduct ourselves towards the inner enemy. There also we have spiritualized hostility. There also we have understood its worth. People are productive only at the cost of having abundant opposition. They only remain young provided the soul does not relax, does not long after peace. Nothing has become more alien to us than the desirability of former times, that of peace of soul, Christian desirability. Nothing makes us less envious than the moral cow and the plump contentment of good conscience. One has renounced grand life when one has renounced war. In many cases, to be sure, peace of soul is merely a misunderstanding, something different, which just does not know how to name itself more honestly. Without circumlocution and prejudice, let us take a few cases. Peace of soul may, for example, be the mild radiation of a rich animality into the moral or religious domain, or the beginning of fatigue, the first shadow which the evening, every sort of evening, casts, or a sign that the air is moist, that southern winds arrive, or unconscious gratitude for a good digestion, occasionally called charitableness, or the quietening down of the convalescent to whom all things have a new taste, and who is waiting in expectancy. or the condition which follows upon a full gratification of our ruling passion, the agreeable feeling of a rare satiety, or the senile weakness of our will, of our desires, of our vices, or laziness persuaded by conceit to deck itself out in moral guise, or the attainment of a certainty, even a dreadful certainty, after long suspense and torture through uncertainty, or the expression of proficiency and mastery in doing, creating, effecting and willing, tranquil breathing, freedom of will attained. Twilight of the idols. Who knows? Perhaps that too is also just a modification of peace of soul. I formulate a principle. All naturalism in morality, that is, all healthy morality, is ruled by an instinct of life. Some command of life is fulfilled by adopting a certain canon of thou shalt and thou shalt not. Some hindrance and hostile agency on the way of life is thereby removed. Anti-natural morality, on the other hand, that is, almost every morality which has hitherto been taught, reverenced and preached, directs itself straight against the instincts of life. It condemns those instincts, sometimes secretly, at other times loudly and insolently. Saying that God looks on the heart, it denies the lowest and the highest desires of life, and takes God as the enemy of life. The saint in whom God finds his highest satisfaction is the ideal castrate. Life is at an end where the kingdom of God begins. If the wickedness of such a mutiny against life, as has become almost sacrosanct in Christian morality, has been understood, something else has, fortunately, been understood besides. The uselessness, the unreality, the absurdity, and the deceitfulness of such a mutiny. For a condemnation of life on the part of a living being is ultimately just the symptom of a certain kind of life. The question whether rightly or wrongly is not at all raised thereby. We would have to have a position outside of life, and yet have to know it as well as each and all who have lived it, to be authorized to touch on the problem of the worth of life at all. Sufficient reason to convince us that for us the problem is inaccessible. Speaking of values, we speak under the influence of the inspiration and the perspective of life. Life itself compels us to fix values. Life itself values through us when we fix values. It follows from this that even that anti-nature in morality, which takes God as the counter-principle and condemnation of life, is only an evaluation of life. Of which life? Of which kind of life? But I have already given the answer. Of declining, weakened, fatigued, condemned life. Morality, as it has hitherto been understood, as it was last formulated by Schopenhauer as denial of the will to life, is the actual decadence instinct, which makes out of itself an imperative. It says, perish. It is the judgment of the condemned. Let us finally consider what naivete it shows to say, man ought to be so-and-so. Reality exhibits an enchanting wealth of types to us, the luxuriance of a prodigality of forms and transformations, and some paltry journeyman of a moralist says with regard to it, no, man ought to be different. He even knows how man ought to be, this parasite and bigot. He paints himself on the wall and says, ecce homo. But even if the moralist directs himself merely to the individual and says, you ought to be so-and-so, he still continues to make himself ridiculous. The individual, in his past and in his future, is a piece of fate, an additional law, an additional necessity for all that now takes place and will take place in the future. To say to him, alter yourself, is to require everything to alter itself, even backwards also. And in reality there have been consistent moralists. They wanted man to be otherwise, namely virtuous. They wanted him fashioned in their likeness, as a bigot. For that purpose they denied the world. No insignificant madness, no modest form of presumption. Morality, in as far as it condemns in itself, and not from regards, considerations, or purposes of life, is a specific error, with which we must have no sympathy. It is a degenerate idiosyncrasy, which has caused an unutterable amount of harm. We others, we immoralists, on the contrary, have opened our hearts for the reception of every kind of intelligence, conception, and approbation. We do not readily deny, we glory in being affirmative. Our eyes have always opened more and more for that economy which still uses and knows how to use for its advantage all that is rejected by the holy delirium of the priest, of the diseased reason of the priest. For that economy in the law of life which even derives advantage from the offensive species of bigots, priests, and the virtuous. What advantage? But we immoralists ourselves are the answer. The four great errors. 1. Error of confusing cause and effect. There is no more dangerous error than confusing consequence with cause. I call it the intrinsic depravity of reason. Nevertheless, this error belongs to the most ancient and the most modern habits of the human race. It is even consecrated among us. It bears the names religion and morality. It is contained in every proposition which religion and morality formulate. Priests and legislators in morals are the originators of this depravity of reason. I take an example. Everybody knows the book of the celebrated Cornaro, in which he recommends his frugal diet as a recipe for a long and happy life, for a virtuous life also. Few books have been read so much. Even now, many thousand copies of it are printed annually in England. I believe hardly any book, the Bible rightly accepted, has caused so much harm, has shortened so many lives as this well-meant curiosity. The source of this mischief is in confusing consequence with cause. The candid Italian saw in his diet the cause of his long life, while the prerequisite to long life, the extraordinary slowness of the metabolic process, small consumption, was the cause of his frugal diet. He was not at liberty to eat little or much. His frugality was not of free will. He became sick when he ate more. He who is not a bony fellow of this sort, however, not only does well to eat properly, but is obliged to do so. A scholar of our day, with his rapid consumption of nervous energy, would kill himself with Cornaro's regime. Credo experto. The most universal formula which lies at the basis of every religious and moral system is, do so-and-so, refrain from so-and-so. Then you will be happy. In case of disobedience, every system of morality, every religion, is this imperative. I call it the great original sin of reason, immortal unreason. In my mouth, that formula transforms into its inversion, the first example of my transvaluation of all values. A man well constituted, a fortunate man, has to do certain actions and instinctively avoids other actions. He introduces the arrangement which he represents physiologically into his relations with men and things. In a formula, his virtue is the result of his good fortune. Long life and an abundant posterity are not the rewards of virtue. The very slowing of the metabolic process, which, among other things, has in its train a long life and abundant posterity, in short, Cornarism, is rather virtue itself. The Church and morality say that a race, a people, is ruined through vice and luxury. My re-established reason says that when a people is perishing, when it degenerates physiologically, vice and luxury follow therefrom. That is, the need of continually stronger and more frequent stimulants, such as every exhausted nature is acquainted with. A young man becomes pale and withered at an early age. His friends say that this or that sickness is the cause of it. My opinion is that the fact of his becoming sick, the fact of his inability to withstand the sickness, was from the first the consequence of an impoverished life and hereditary exhaustion. The newspaper readers say that this party ruins itself by such and such an error. My higher politics say that a party which commits such errors is at its end. Its instincts are no longer to be relied upon. Every error, whatever it may be, is the result of degeneration of instinct, disgregation of will. We thereby almost define the bad. Everything good is instinct, and consequently easy, necessary, free. Trouble is an objection. The god is typically distinguished from the hero. In my language, light feet are the first attribute of divinity. Error of false causality. It was always believed that we knew what a cause was. But from where did we derive our knowledge, or more exactly, our belief that we knew about the matter? Out of the domain of the celebrated inner facts, none of which have hitherto proved themselves actual. We believed that we ourselves acted causally in the exercise of will. We thought there, at least, we had surprised causality in the very act. In the same way, people did not doubt that all the antecedentia of an action, its causes, were to be sought in consciousness, and would be rediscovered there, if sought for, as motives. For otherwise, man would not have been free to act. He would not have been answerable for his actions. Finally, who would have disputed that a thought is caused, that the ego causes the thought? Of those three inner facts by which causality appeared to be guaranteed, the first and most convincing is that of will as a cause, the conception of consciousness, spirit, as cause, and later still that of the ego, the subject, as cause, are merely posthumous and have originated when causality, derived from will, was established as a given fact, as empiricism. In the meantime, we have changed our mind. We no longer believe a word of it all. The inner world is full of phantoms and will-o'-the-wisps. Will is one of them. Will no longer moves anything. Consequently, also, it no longer explains anything. It merely accompanies proceedings. It can also be absent. The so-called motive, another error. Merely a surface phenomenon of consciousness, some accompaniment of an act, which conceals the antecedentia of an act rather than manifests them. And, above all, the ego. It has become a fable, a fiction, a play upon words. It has altogether ceased to think, to feel, and to will. What follows from it? There are no spiritual causes at all. The whole of the alleged empiricism that seemed to be in their favour has gone to the devil. This is what follows from it. And we had made a fine abuse of that empiricism. We had created the world on that basis, as a world of causes, as a world of will, as a world of spirit. The oldest and the longest maintained psychology has been at work here. It has really done nothing else. According to this psychology, every occurrence was an action. Every action was the result of a will. The world, according to it, became a plurality of acting agents. An acting agent, a subject, was insinuated into every occurrence. Man has projected outside himself his three inner facts, that in which he believed most firmly of all, will, spirit, and the ego. He only derived the conception of being from the conception of the ego. He posited things as existing according to his own likeness, according to his conception of the ego as cause. No wonder that later on he always just rediscovered in things what he had concealed in them. The thing itself, we repeat, the conception of a thing, is merely a reflection of the belief in the ego as a cause, and even your atom, messieurs, the mechanists and physicists, how much error, how much rudimentary psychology yet remains in your atom. Not to speak of the thing in itself, the ugly, shameful part of metaphysicians. The error of spirit as a cause, confused with reality, and made the measure of reality, and called God. Error of imaginary causes. To start from the dream. For a definite sensation resulting, for example, from the distant shot of a cannon, there is a cause subsequently foisted on, often quite a little romance, in which the dreamer himself is the hero. The sensation, in the meantime, persists as a sort of resonance. It waits, as it were, until the causal impulse permits it to move into the foreground of consciousness, now no longer as a fortuitous incident, but as meaning. The cannon shot appears in a causal connection, with a seeming inversion of time. That which comes later, the motivation, is experienced first, often with 100 details which pass like lightning. The shot follows. What has happened? The ideas generated by a certain bodily state were mistaken for its cause. As a matter of fact, we do just the same when we are awake. Most of our general sensations, every sort of check, pressure, tension, or explosion in the play and counterplay of organs, especially the condition of the nervus sympathicus, excite our causal impulse. We want a reason for feeling so-and-so, for feeling ill or well. It never suffices as merely to establish the fact that we feel so-and-so. We only acknowledge this fact, we only become conscious of it, when we have furnished it with some kind of motivation. The recollection, which in such cases becomes active without our being aware of it, calls up earlier conditions of the same kind, and the causal interpretations associated with them, not their causality. The belief that the associated ideas, the accompanying proceedings of consciousness, have been the causes, is also, to be sure, called up by recollection. There thus originates an habituation to a fixed causal interpretation, which, in truth, checks the investigation of causes and even excludes it. Psychological explanation. To trace back something unknown to something known relieves, quiets, and satisfies, besides giving a sensation of power. There is danger, disquiet, and anxiety associated with the unknown. The primary instinct aims at doing away with these painful conditions. First principle. Any explanation whatsoever is better than none, since, after all, it is only a question of wanting to get rid of depressing ideas. People are not especially careful about the means of getting rid of them. The first conception, by which the unknown declares itself to be something known, is so pleasing that it is taken as true. Proof of desire, power, as criterion of truth. The causal impulse is thus conditioned and excited by the feeling of terror. The why is intended, if possible, not so much for furnishing the cause on its own account, as for furnishing a species of cause, a soothing, liberating, alleviating cause. The first result of this need is that something already known, something experienced, something inscribed in the memory, is assigned as cause. The new, the unexperienced, the strange, are excluded from being a cause. Thus there is not only a mode of explanation sought for as cause, but a select and privileged mode of explanation, that by means of which the feeling of the strange, the new, and the unexperienced has been most quickly and most frequently got rid of. the most common explanations. Result: a particular mode of assigning causes preponderates more and more, concentrates itself into a system, and finally becomes predominant, that is, simply excluding other causes and explanations. The banker immediately thinks of business, the Christian of sin, and the girl of her love. The whole domain of morality and religion comes under this conception of imaginary causes. Explanation of unpleasant general feelings. They arise from beings hostile to us, evil spirits, the most striking case, mistaking hysterics for witches. They arise from conduct not to be approved of, the feeling of sin, of sinfulness, foisted onto a physiological unpleasantness. One always finds reasons for being discontented with oneself. They arise from punishments, as a requital for something we should not have done, for being otherwise than we ought to be, audaciously generalized by Schopenhauer into a thesis in which morality appears undisguised as the actual poisoner and calumniator of life. Every sore pain, whether bodily or mental, indicates what we deserve, for it could not come upon us unless we deserved it. World as Will and Idea, 666. They arise as consequences of inconsiderate actions which turn out badly. The emotions, the senses, assigned as cause, as guilty. States of physiological trouble explained as deserved by means of other states of trouble. Explanations of pleasant general feelings. They arise from trust in God. They arise from the consciousness of good conduct, so-called good conscience, a physiological condition sometimes so like a good digestion as to be mistaken for it. They arise from the successful issue of undertakings, a naive fallacy. The successful issue of an undertaking does not at all produce any pleasant general feelings in a hypochondriac or in a Pascal. They arise from faith, hope, and love, the Christian virtues. In fact, all these presumed explanations are resulting conditions, and, as it were, translations of pleasant and unpleasant feelings into a false dialect. We are in a condition to be hopeful because our fundamental physiological feeling is again strong and rich. We trust in God because the feeling of fullness and of strength gives us peace. Morality and religion belong entirely to the psychology of error. In every individual case, cause and consequence are confused, or truth is confused with the result of what is believed to be true, or a condition of consciousness is confused with the causation of this condition. Error of free will. Now we no longer have sympathy with the notion of free will. We know only too well what it is, the most disreputable of all theological devices, for the purpose of making men responsible in their sense of the word, that is, for the purpose of making them dependent on theologians. Here I only give the psychology of the process of making men responsible. Wherever responsibility is sought after, it is usually the instinct prompting to punish or condemn which seeks after it. Becoming has been divested of its innocence when any mode of being whatsoever is traced back to will, to purposes or acts of responsibility. The dogma of will has principally been invented for the purpose of punishment, that is, with the intention of finding guilty. The whole of old-style psychology, the psychology of will, would have been impossible, but for the fact that its originators, the priests at the head of the old commonwealths, wanted to create for themselves a right to impose punishment, or a right for God to do so. Men were imagined to be free in order that they might be condemned and punished, in order that they might become guilty. Consequently, every activity had to be thought of as voluntary. The origin of every activity had to be thought of as residing in consciousness. whereby the most absolute false coinage in psychologicis was made a principle of psychology itself. Now, when we have entered upon a movement in the opposite direction, when we immoralists especially endeavour with all our power to remove out of the world the notions of guilt and punishment, and seek to cleanse psychology, history, nature, social institutions and sanctions from these notions, there is not, in our eyes, any more fundamental antagonism than that of theologians, who, with the notion of a moral order of the world, go on tainting the innocence of becoming with punishment and guilt. Christianity is the hangman's metaphysics. What alone can our teaching be? That no one gives a man his qualities, neither God nor society, nor his parents and ancestors, nor he himself. The latter absurd idea, here last rejected, has been taught as intelligible freedom by Kant, perhaps also by Plato. No one is responsible for existing at all, for being formed in this way or that, for being placed under those circumstances and in this environment. His own destiny cannot be disentangled from the destiny of everything else in the past and the future. He is not the result of a special purpose, a will, or an aim. The attempt is not made here to reach an ideal of man, an ideal of happiness, or an ideal of morality. It is absurd to try to shunt off man's nature towards some goal. We have invented the notion of a goal. In reality, a goal is lacking. We are necessary. We are part of destiny. We belong to the whole. We exist in the whole. There is nothing which could judge, measure, compare, or condemn our being, for that would be to judge, measure, compare, and condemn the whole. But there is nothing outside of the whole. This alone is the grand emancipation, that no one is made responsible any longer, that the mode of being is not traced back to a causa prima, that the world is not regarded as a unity, either as sensorium or as spirit. It is only by this that the innocence of becoming is again restored. The concept of God has hitherto been the greatest objection to existence. We deny God. We deny responsibility by denying God. It is only through this that we save the world. The improvers of mankind. 1. It is known what I require of philosophers, namely, to take up their position beyond good and evil, to be superior to the illusion of moral sentiment. This requirement follows from a principle which I formulated for the first time, namely, that there is no such thing as a moral fact. Moral sentiment has this in common with religious sentiment. It believes in realities which do not exist. Morality is only an interpretation of certain phenomena, or, more precisely, a misinterpretation of them. Moral sentiment belongs, like religious sentiment, to a stage of ignorance in which the very notion of the real, the distinction between the real and the imaginary, is lacking. Accordingly, at such a stage of intellectual development, truth designates nothing but what we at present call fancies. To this extent, the moral sentiment is never to be taken literally. As such, it contains nothing but absurdity. As semiotic, however, its worth remains inestimable. It reveals, at least to the initiated, the most important realities of civilizations, and internal operations which did not know sufficient to understand themselves. Morality is merely sign language, merely symptomatology. One has to know beforehand what it deals with in order to derive advantage from it. A first example, and just as an introduction. At all times, efforts have been made to improve human beings. It is that above all things which has been termed morality. The most different tendencies, however, are concealed under the same name. The taming of animal man as well as the breeding of a particular species of human beings, has been called improving. Only these zoological termini express realities, realities of which the typical improver, the priest, knows nothing, does not want to know anything. To call the taming of an animal the improving of it sounds almost like a joke to our ears. Anybody who knows what goes on in menageries will be doubtful about the improving of animals there. They are weakened. They are made less mischievous. They become sick by the depressing emotion of fear, by pain, wounds, and hunger. It is precisely the same with tamed man, whom the priest has improved. In the early Middle Ages, when in fact the church was a menagerie more than anything else, the finest specimens of the blonde beast were pursued everywhere. The distinguished Germanics, for example, were improved. Afterwards, however, how did such a Germanic look when improved, when seduced into the monastery? Like a caricature of man, like an abortion. He had become a sinner. He was stuck fast in the cage. He had got shut up in the midst of nothing but frightful notions. And now he lay there, sick, miserable, ill-disposed towards himself, full of hatred against the vital instincts, full of suspicion with regard to everything still strong and happy. In short, a Christian. Physiologically explained, in combat with the animal, the only way to make it weak can be to sicken it. The Church understood this. It ruined man. It weakened him. But it claimed to have improved him. Let us take the other case of so-called morality, the case of breeding a distinct race and species. Indian morality, sanctioned into a religion as the law of Manu, provides the grandest example. The task here is to breed no fewer than 4 races all at once: a priestly race, a warrior race, a trading and agricultural race, and finally a menial race, the Sudras. Here we are obviously no longer among the tamers of animals. A race of men 100 times milder and more reasonable is presupposed, even to conceive the plan of such a system of breeding. One recovers breath on stepping into this healthier, higher, and wider world out of the sick-room air and prison air of Christianity. How paltry is the New Testament in comparison with Manu! What a bad odour it has! But that organization, too, needed to be formidable, not this time in combat with the beast, but in its own antithesis, the non-caste man, the mishmash man, the Chandala. And again, it had no other expedient for making him harmless, for making him weak, except making him sick. It was the struggle with the great number. Perhaps there is nothing more repugnant to our feelings than those precautionary measures of Indian morality. The third edict, for example, Avadana Sastra 1, concerning unclean vegetables, ordains that the sole food allowed to the Chandalas shall be garlic and onions, considering that the holy writings forbid giving them grain, grain-bearing fruits, water, and fire. The same edict ordains that the water they require must not be taken out of rivers, springs, or ponds, but only out of the entrances to swamps, and out of holes made by the footsteps of animals. In the same manner they are forbidden both to wash their clothes and to wash themselves, since the water, which is conceded to them as a favour, must only be used to quench their thirst. Finally, there is a prohibition forbidding the Sudra women to assist the Chandala women at childbirth. In the same way also a prohibition forbidding the latter to assist one another on such occasions. The result of such sanitary regulations did not fail to appear: deadly epidemics, frightful sexual diseases, and, in consequence of this, the law of the knife once more, which ordained circumcision for the male children and the removal of the labia minora in the females, Manu himself says, "The Chandalas are the fruit of adultery, incest, and crime." This is the necessary consequence of the concept of breeding. They shall have only the rags of corpses for clothing. For vessels, they shall only have broken pottery. For ornaments, old iron. For the worship of God, only the evil spirits. They shall wander from place to place without repose. They are forbidden to write from left to right, or to use the right hand in writing. The use of the right hand and the left-to-right motion are reserved exclusively for the virtuous, for persons of race. These enactments are sufficiently instructive. Here, for once, we have Aryan humanity, perfectly pure, perfectly original. We learn that the idea of pure blood is the contrary of a harmless idea. On the other hand, it becomes manifest in which nation the hatred, the Chandala hatred against this humanity, has immortalized itself, where it has become religion and genius. From this point of view, the Gospels are documents of the first importance, and the Book of Enoch even more so. Christianity, springing out of a Jewish root, and only comprehensible as a growth of this soil, represents the movement counter to every morality of breeding, of race, and of privilege. It is anti-Aryan religion, par excellence. Christianity, the transvaluation of all Aryan values, the triumph of Chandala values, the gospel preached to the poor and lowly, the collective insurrection against race of all the downtrodden, the wretched, the ill-constituted, the misfortunate. Undying Chandala revenge as religion of love. The morality of breeding and the morality of taming are perfectly worthy of one another as regards the expedients for achieving their ends. We may set it down as our highest proposition, that in order to create morality, it is necessary to have the absolute will to the contrary. This is the great, the unearthly problem which I have pursued furthest, the psychology of the improvers of mankind. A small and modest matter, after all, so-called pious fraud, gave me the first access to this problem. Pious fraud, the heritage of all philosophers and priests who have improved mankind. Neither Manu, nor Plato, nor Confucius, nor the Jewish and Christian teachers have ever doubted their right to use falsehood. They have not doubted with regard to other rights. Expressed in a formula, one might say that all the measures hitherto used for the purpose of moralizing mankind have been fundamentally immoral. What the Germans lack. 1. Among Germans at present it is not sufficient to have esprit. One must appropriate it practically. One must presume to have it. Perhaps I know the Germans. Perhaps I may even say a few truths to them. Modern Germany exhibits a great amount of hereditary and indoctrinated capacity, so that it can even spend prodigally for a while its accumulated treasure of force. It is not a high civilization that has gained the ascendancy here, still less a delicate taste or a superior beauty of the instincts, but manlier virtues than any other country in Europe can exhibit. Much good humour and self-respect, much firmness in dealing with one another, in reciprocity of obligations, much industriousness, much endurance, and a hereditary moderation which requires the goad rather than the brake. I also add that there is still obedience here, without its being humiliating, and nobody despises his opponent. It is obviously my wish to be just to the Germans. I should not like to be unfaithful to myself in this matter. Consequently, I have to tell them what I object to. It costs dear to attain power. Power stupefies. The Germans, they were once called the nation of thinkers. Do they really, at present, think at all? The Germans are bored with intellect nowadays. They mistrust it. Politics swallows up all seriousness for really intellectual matters. Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. I fear that has been the end of German philosophy. Are there German philosophers? Are there German poets? Are there good German books? People ask me abroad. I blush, but with the courage which is peculiar to me, even in desperate cases, I answer, yes, Bismarck. Could I even dare to confess what books people read nowadays? A cursed instinct of mediocrity. Who has not had melancholy reflections concerning the possibilities of German esprit? But this nation has arbitrarily stupefied itself for nearly 1,000 years. Nowhere have the two great European narcotics, alcohol and Christianity, been more wickedly misused. Recently a third has been introduced, with which alone every refined and bold activity of intellect can be wiped out. Music, our constipating German music. How much moody heaviness, lameness, humidity and dressing-gown mode. How much beer is in German intelligence. How is it really possible that young men who consecrate their existence to the most intellectual ends do not feel in themselves the first instinct of intellectuality, the self-preservative instinct of intellect, and drink beer? The alcoholism of the learned youth is perhaps no question mark with reference to their learnedness. One can be very learned even without esprit. But in every other respect it remains a problem. Where do we not find it, the mild intellectual degeneration caused by beer? I once put my finger on an instance of such degeneration, a case that has almost become celebrated. That of our first German freethinker, the shrewd David Strauss, who degenerated into an author of a drinking saloon gospel and a new belief. Not with impunity had he made his vow in verses to the lovely brunette. Loyalty to death. I spoke of German esprit to the effect that it becomes coarser and shallower. Is that enough? In reality, it is something quite different which frightens me. German seriousness, German profundity, and German passion in intellectual matters are more and more on the decline. Pathos has altered, not merely intellectually. I come in contact now and then with German universities. What an atmosphere prevails among their scholars! What withered, contented, and lukewarm intellectuality! It would be a great misunderstanding if a person should adduce German science by way of objection to me, and, besides, it would be a proof that he had not read a word of my writings. For 17 years I have not tired of showing the intellectually enervating influence of our modern scientific pursuits. The severe helotism to which the immense extent of the sciences at present condemns every individual is a principal reason why the more fully, more richly, and more profoundly endowed natures no longer find suitable education and suitable educators. There is nothing from which our civilization suffers more than from the superfluity of presumptuous journeymen and fragmental humanities. Our universities are, against their will, the real forcing houses for this mode of stunted growth of intellectual instincts. And all Europe already has an idea of this. Grand politics deceive nobody. Germany is more and more regarded as the flat land of Europe. I still seek for a German with whom I might be serious in my own way. How much more for one with whom I could be cheerful. Twilight of the idols. Ah, who can conceive at present from what seriousness a philosopher here recruits himself? Our cheerfulness is what is least understood. Let us make an estimate. It is not only manifest that German civilization declines, there is also sufficient reason for it. No one can ultimately spend more than he possesses. That is true of individuals. It is true also of nations. If we expend our means on power, grand politics, economy, international commerce, parliamentarism, or military interests, if we give away the quantity of understanding, seriousness, will, and self-overcoming which constitutes us on this side, it is lacking on the other. Civilization and the state, let us not delude ourselves with regard to the matter, are antagonists. Civilized state is merely a modern idea. The one lives on the other, the one flourishes at the expense of the other. All great periods of civilization are periods of political decadence. Whatever has been great as regards civilization has been non-political, even anti-political. Goethe's heart opened on the phenomenon of Napoleon. It closed on the War of Liberation. At the same time that Germany comes forward as a great power, France acquires a changed importance as a power of civilization. Much new intellectual seriousness and passion has already transferred to Paris. The question of pessimism, for example, the question of Wagner, and almost all psychological and artistic questions are discussed there in an incomparably more refined and more thorough manner than in Germany. The Germans themselves are incapacitated for that kind of seriousness. In the history of European civilization, there is one thing especially which the rise of the empire indicates: a displacement of the centre of gravity. Everybody is aware of it already. In the most important matter, and that is civilization, the Germans are no longer of any account. It is asked, have you even a single intellect to point to that counts in Europe, as your Goethe, your Hegel, your Heinrich Heine, and your Schopenhauer counted? There is no end of astonishment that there is no longer a single German philosopher. In all higher education in Germany, the main thing has been lost, the end as well as the means for reaching it. That education, culture itself, is the end, and not the empire, that for this end there is need of educators, not public school teachers and university scholars, that has been forgotten. Educators are necessary who are educated themselves, superior, noble intellects, who are proved every moment, who are proved whether they speak or are silent, mature and sweetened civilizations. Not the learned bores which the public schools and universities at present offer to the youths as higher nurses. The educators are lacking, save the exceptions of exceptions, the primary prerequisite of education. Hence the decadence of German civilization. One of those rarest exceptions is my worthy friend Jakob Burckhardt of Basel. It is to him, above all, that Basel owes its preeminence in the humanities. What the higher schools of Germany actually achieve is a brutal training, in order that, with the least possible loss of time, an immense number of young men may be fit to be used and used up as government officials. Higher education and immense numbers, that is a contradiction in principle. All higher education belongs to the exceptions only. One has to be privileged to have a right to so high a privilege. All that is great, all that is fine, can never be a common possession. Beauty is for the few. What determines the decadence of German civilization? That higher education is no longer a privilege. Democratism of universal communized culture. Not to forget that military privileges compel the too great attendance at the higher schools, which means their ruin. In the Germany of today, no one is any longer at liberty to give his children a noble education. Our higher schools are all of them adapted to the most equivocal mediocrity, as regards their teachers, plans of study, and educational aims. And everywhere there is an unbecoming haste, as if something were wrong when the young man of 23 is not yet finished, does not yet know the answer to the main question. What calling? A higher class of men, let it be said, do not like callings, precisely because they know they are called. They have time. They take their time. They do not think at all about getting finished. At 30 years of age, a person is a beginner, a child in the sphere of high civilization. Our overfilled public schools, our overloaded, stupefied public school teachers are a scandal. There may perhaps be motives for defending this condition of things, as the professors of Heidelberg have done recently. There are no reasons for it. In order not to come short of my special mode, which is affirmative and only deals mediately and involuntarily with contradiction and criticism, I state at once the 3 tasks for the fulfillment of which educators are required. The youth have to learn to see, they have to learn to think, they have to learn to speak and write. The object in all 3 cases is a noble civilization. To learn to see, to accustom the eye to quietness, to patience, to reserve, to postpone judgment, to survey and comprehend each case from all sides. This is the first preliminary schooling for intellectuality, not to react immediately upon a stimulus, but to get the checking, the settling instincts in hand. Learning to see, as I understand it, is almost the same thing as in unphilosophical language is called strong will. The essential thing there is precisely not to will, the ability to defer decision. All unspirituality, all vulgarity rests on the inability to offer resistance to a stimulus. People are obliged to react. They follow every impulse. In many cases, such a compulsion is already morbidity, decadence, a symptom of exhaustion. Almost everything that unphilosophical crudeness designates by the word vice is merely that physiological inability not to react. A practical application of having learned to see. As learners, people will in general have become slow, mistrustful, and reluctant. With hostile calm, they will let the strange and the new of every description approach at first. They will withdraw their hand so as not to be touched by it. The being open by all doors, the servile prostration before every insignificant fact, the continuous lurking to put oneself, to throw oneself among other people and other things, in short, celebrated modern objectivity, is bad taste. It is ignoble par excellence, learning to think. People no longer have any notion of it in our schools. Even in the universities, even among philosophical scholars themselves, logic begins to die out as a theory, as a practice, and as a profession. Let anyone read German books. There is no longer the remotest recollection that a technique, a plan of instruction, and a will to reach proficiency are required for thinking. That thinking requires to be learned as dancing requires to be learned, as a mode of dancing. Who among the Germans as yet knows by experience that refined tremor which nimble feet in the field of intellect communicate to all muscles? The stiff doltishness of intellectual bearing, the clumsy hand in grasping. That is German to such a degree that abroad it is altogether confounded with the German nature. The German has no fingers for nuances. That the Germans have even endured their philosophers, more especially the most deformed conceptual cripple that has ever existed, the great Kant, gives a good idea of German elegance. In effect, no form of dancing can be excluded from a high-class education. Ability to dance with the feet, with concepts, and with words. Do I still have to say that one must be capable of it with the pen also? One must learn to write? But at this point, I should become a perfect puzzle to German readers. Roving expeditions of an inopportune philosopher. 1. My impracticables. Seneca, or the Toreador of Virtue. Rousseau, or Return to Nature in Impuris Naturalibus. Schiller, or the moral trumpeter of Säckingen, Dante, or the hyena poetizing in tombs, Kant, or Kant as an intelligible character, Victor Hugo, or Pharos in the Sea of Absurdity, Liszt, or the School of Running After Women, Georges Sand, or Lactea Ubertas, that is, the milk cow with the fine style, Michelet, or enthusiasm which strips off the jacket, Carlyle, or pessimism as indigestion, John Stuart Mill, or offensive transparency, Les Frères de Goncourt, or the two Ajaxes struggling with Homer, music by Offenbach, Zola, or delight in stinking, Renan. Divinity, or the perversion of reason by original sin, Christianity, witness Renan, who, whenever he ventures a more general affirmation or negation, misses the point with painful regularity. For example, he would like to unite into one la science and la noblesse. La science, however, belongs to democracy. That is perfectly obvious. He desires, with no little ambition, to represent an intellectual aristocratism, but at the same time he falls on his knees, and not on his knees only, before the antithetical doctrine, the gospel of the humble. What is the good of all free-thinking, modernism, jibing and wry-necked dexterity, if you continue to be a Christian, a Roman Catholic, and even a priest in your intestines? Renan's ingenuity lies in his seductiveness, just as in the case of the Jesuit and the confessor. The broad priestly smirk is not lacking in his intellectuality. Like all priests, he only becomes dangerous when he loves. Nobody equals him in his faculty for idolizing in a fatally dangerous manner. This spirit of Renan, a spirit which enervates, is an additional calamity for poor, sick, feeble-willed France. Sainte-Beuve. Nothing of a man, full of petty resentment against all masculine intellects, wanders about, delicate, curious, tired, eavesdropping, a female after all, with a woman's revengefulness and a woman's sensuousness. As a psychologist, a genius for médisance, scandal, inexhaustibly rich in expedients for the purpose. Nobody understands better how to mix poison with praise. Plebeian in his lowest instincts, and allied with the resentment of Rousseau. Consequently, a romantic, for Rousseau's instinct grunts and yearns for revenge under all romanticism. A revolutionary, though held tolerably in check by fear, ill at ease in the presence of everything possessing strength, public opinion, the Academy, the Court, and even Port Royal. Embittered against all greatness in men and things, against all that believes in itself. Poet enough and half woman enough to be sensible of greatness as a power, continually turning like the celebrated worm because he continually feels himself trodden upon. As a critic, without a standard, without firmness and without backbone, with the tongue of the cosmopolitan libertin in favour of variety, but without even sufficient courage to confess the libertinage. As an historian, without a philosophy, without the power of philosophical vision, on that account declining the task of passing judgment in all great questions, holding up objectivity as a mask. He behaves otherwise, however, with regard to all matters where a delicate, worn-out taste is the highest tribunal. There he really has the courage of himself, pleasure in himself. There he is a master. In some respects, a prototype of Baudelaire. The Imitatio Christi is one of the books which I cannot hold in my hand without a physiological resistance. It exhales a perfume of the eternally feminine, for which one has to be French, or a Wagnerian. This saint has such a way of speaking about love that even the Parisienne become curious. I am told that a Comte, that shrewdest of Jesuits, who wanted to lead his fellow countrymen to Rome by the indirect route of science, inspired himself with this book. I believe it, The Religion of the Heart. George Eliot. They have got rid of the Christian God, and now think themselves obliged to cling more firmly than ever to Christian morality. That is English consistency. We shall not lay the blame of it on ethical girls à la Eliot. In England, for every little emancipation from theology, people have to reacquire respectability by becoming moral fanatics in an awe-inspiring manner. That is the penalty they have to pay there. With us it is different. When we give up Christian belief, we thereby deprive ourselves of the right to maintain a stand on Christian morality. This is not at all obvious in itself. We have again and again to make this point clear, in defiance of English shallow-pates. Christianity is a system, a view of things, consistently thought out and complete. If we break a fundamental idea out of it, the belief in God, we thereby break the whole into pieces. We no longer have anything firm in our grasp. Christianity presupposes that man does not know, cannot know, what is good for him and what is evil. He believes in God, who alone knows. Christian morality is a command. Its origin is transcendent. It is beyond all criticism, beyond all right of criticism. It has solely truth, if God is truth. It stands or falls with the belief in God. If, in fact, the English imagine they know of their own accord, intuitively, what is good and evil, if they consequently imagine they have no more need of Christianity as a guarantee of morality, that itself is merely the result of the ascendancy of Christian evaluation, and an expression of its strength and profundity, to such an extent that the origin of English morality has been forgotten, to such an extent that the strictly conditional character of its right to existence is no longer perceived. Morality is not, as yet, a problem for the English. George Sand. I read the first Letters of a Traveller. Like everything derived from Rousseau, false, artificial, inflated, exaggerated. I cannot stand this variegated wallpaper style, nor the vulgar ambition for generous feelings. But the worst, surely, is the woman's coquetry with masculine characteristics, with the manners of ill-bred boys. How cold she must have been as well, this insufferable artist. She wound herself up like a timepiece and wrote, cold, like Hugo, like Balzac, like all romantics, as soon as they began to write. And how self-complacently she may then have rested, this productive writing cow, who, like her master Rousseau himself, had in her something German in the bad sense, and at all events was only possible owing to the decline of French taste. But Renan adores her. A moral for psychologists, never to occupy oneself with coal-portage psychology. Never to observe for the sake of observing. That results in a false perspective, in squinting, in something forced and exaggerated. Experiencing, as a desire to experience, that is no good. In experiencing anything, one must not look towards oneself. Every look then becomes an evil eye. A born psychologist is instinctively on his guard against seeing for the sake of seeing. The same is true of the born painter. He never works according to nature. He leaves the sifting and expressing of the case of nature, or of the experienced, to his instinct, to his camera obscura. He only becomes conscious of what is general, the conclusion, the result. He is unacquainted with that arbitrary abstracting from individual cases. What is the result when people do otherwise? For example, when they carry on coal-portage psychology after the manner of great and small Parisian romanciers. That mode of business lies in wait, as it were, for reality, It brings home a handful of curiosities every evening. But let us just see what finally results from it. A pile of daubs, at the best a mosaic in every case, something pieced together, disquieting, loudly coloured. The Goncourts are the worst sinners in this respect. They do not put 3 sentences together which are not simply painful to the eye, to the psychologist's eye. Nature, considered artistically, is no model. It exaggerates, it distorts, it leaves gaps. Nature is accident. Studying according to nature seems to me a bad sign. It betrays subjection, weakness, fatalism. This lying in the dust before petty facts is unworthy of a complete artist. Seeing what is, that belongs to another species of intellects, to the anti-artistic, to the practical. One has to know who one is, a psychology of the artist. For the existence of art, for the existence of any aesthetic activity or perception whatsoever, a preliminary psychological condition is indispensable, namely, ecstasy. Ecstasy must first have intensified the sensitivity of the whole mechanism. Until this takes place, art is not realized. All kinds of ecstasy, however differently conditioned, possess this power. Above all, the ecstasy of sexual excitement, the oldest and most primitive form of ecstasy. Likewise, the ecstasy which follows in the train of all great desires, of all strong emotions, the ecstasy of the feast, of the contest, of a daring deed, of victory, of all extreme agitation, the ecstasy of cruelty, the ecstasy in destruction, the ecstasy under certain meteorological influences, for example, spring ecstasy, or under the influence of narcotics. Finally, the ecstasy of will, the ecstasy of an overcharged and surging will. The essential thing in ecstasy is the feeling of increased power and profusion. Out of this feeling we impart to things, we constrain them to accept something from us, we force them by violence. This proceeding is called idealizing. Let us free ourselves from a prejudice here. Idealizing does not consist, as is commonly believed, in an abstraction or deduction of the insignificant or the contingent. An immense forcing out of principal traits is rather the decisive characteristic, so that the others thereby disappear. In this condition we enrich everything out of our own profusion. What we see, and what we wish for, we see enlarged, crowded, strong, and overladen with power. He who is in this condition transforms things till they mirror his power, till they are reflections of his perfection. This constraint to transform into the perfect is art. Everything that he is not, nevertheless, becomes a delight for him in himself. In art, man enjoys himself as perfection. It would be allowable to imagine an opposite state of things, a specific anti-artisticality of instinct, a mode of being which would impoverish everything, attenuate everything, make everything consumptive. In fact, history provides us with an abundance of such anti-artists, persons with starved lives, who must necessarily take hold of things, drain them, and make them more emaciated. This is the case with the genuine Christian, Pascal, for example. A Christian who is at the same time an artist is not to be found. Let no one be childish enough to refer me to the case of Raphael, or to any homeopathic Christian of the 19th century. Raphael said yes, he did yes. Consequently, Raphael was no Christian. What do the antithetical notions Apollinian and Dionysian, which I have introduced into aesthetics, imply, when we conceive of them both as modes of ecstasy? Apollinian ecstasy, above all, keeps an eye on the alert, so that it requires the faculty of vision. The painter, the sculptor, and the epic poet are visionaries par excellence. In the Dionysian condition, on the other hand, the entire emotional system is excited, and has its energies augmented, so that it discharges itself simultaneously by all channels of expression, and forces the faculties of representation, of imitation, of transfiguration, of metamorphosis, all kinds of mimicry and acting, into activity at one and the same time. The essential thing is the ease of the metamorphosis, the incapacity to resist a stimulus, similar to the case of certain hysterical patients who also act every role at every hint. It is impossible for Dionysian man not to understand any suggestion. He overlooks no symptom of emotion. He possesses the highest manifestation of knowing and divining instinct, as well as the highest development of communicative art. He assumes every external appearance, every emotion. He changes himself continually. Music, as we understand it at present, is also a collective excitement and collective discharge of the emotions. Nevertheless, it is only the survival of a much wider world of emotional expression, a mere residuum of Dionysian histrionicism. To make music possible as a separate art, several of the senses, especially muscular sense, have here been eliminated, relatively at least, for to a certain extent all rhythm still speaks to our muscles, so that man no longer immediately imitates and gives bodily expression to every feeling. Nevertheless, that is the Dionysian normal condition, at any rate the original condition. Music is the slowly attained specialization of this condition at the cost of the faculties most closely related to it. The actor, the mime, the dancer, the musician, and the lyric poet are fundamentally related in their instincts and one in their essence, but they have gradually specialized and separated from one another, till, indeed, they are in contradiction. The lyric poet remained united longest with the musician. The actor remained connected longest with the dancer. The architect represents neither a Dionysian nor an Apollinian condition. Here it is the great act of will, the will which removes mountains, the ecstasy of strong will that is desirous of art. The most powerful men have always inspired architects. The architect has always been under the suggestion of power. In the work of architecture, pride, triumph over gravity, and will to power are intended to display themselves. Architecture is a sort of eloquence of power, embodied in forms, sometimes persuading, even flattering, and sometimes merely commanding. The highest feeling of power and security is expressed in that which has the grand style. Power which needs no further demonstration, which scorns to please, which answers unwillingly, which has no sense of any witness near it, which is without consciousness that there is opposition to it, which reposes in itself, fatalistic, a law among laws, that is what speaks of itself as the grand style. I read The Life of Thomas Carlyle, that unconscious and unintended farce, that heroical moral interpretation of dyspeptic conditions. Carlyle, a man of strong words and attitudes, a rhetorician from necessity, who was continually irritated by the longing for a strong belief and the feeling of incapacity for it, in that respect a typical romantic. The longing for a strong belief is not evidence of a strong belief, rather the contrary. When one has this belief, one may allow oneself the choice luxury of skepticism. One is sufficiently sure, sufficiently resolute, and sufficiently bound for doing so. Carlyle deafens something in his nature by the fortissimo of his reverence for men of strong belief, and by his rage against the less stupid. He requires noise, a constant passionate insincerity towards himself. That is his own. He is interesting, and will remain interesting because of that. In England, to be sure, he is admired precisely on account of his sincerity. Well, that is English, and in consideration that the English are the people of consummate cant, it is not merely conceivable but appropriate. After all, Carlyle is an English atheist who aspires to honour for not being one. Emerson, much more enlightened, more discursive, more varied, more refined than Carlyle, above all, more fortunate, one who instinctively nourishes himself solely with ambrosia, leaving alone what is indigestible in things. A man of taste in comparison with Carlyle. Carlyle, who had much love for Emerson, said nevertheless, "He does not give us enough to chew," which may rightly be said, but not to Emerson's prejudice. Emerson possesses that kind-hearted and ingenuous cheerfulness which discourages all sternness. He does not by any means know how old he is already and how young he will yet be. He could say of himself, with an expression of Lope de Vega, "I am my own successor." His mind always finds reasons for being contented and even grateful, and now and then verges on the cheerful transcendence of that worthy man, who, returning from a love appointment as if things had gone well, said thankfully, "Though the power be lacking, the lust is praiseworthy." Anti-Darwin. As regards the celebrated struggle for life, it seems to me, in the meantime, to be more asserted than proved. It occurs, but only as an exception. The general aspect of life is not a state of want or hunger. It is, rather, a state of opulence, luxuriance, and even absurd prodigality. Where there is a struggle, it is a struggle for power. We must not confuse Malthus with nature. Granted, however, that this struggle exists, and in fact it does occur, its results, alas, are the reverse of what the Darwinian school wish, the reverse of what one might perhaps wish, in accordance with them. It is prejudicial to the strong, the privileged, the fortunate exceptions. The species does not grow in perfection. The weak again and again get the upper hand of the strong. Their large number and their greater cunning are the cause of it. Darwin forgot the intellect. That was English. The weak have more intellect. One must need intellect in order to acquire it. One loses it when it is no longer necessary. He who has strength rids himself of intellect. Let it depart, is what people think in Germany at present. The empire will remain. As is obvious, under intellect I include foresight, patience, craft, dissimulation, grand self-control, and all modifications of mimicry. A great deal of so-called virtue is included under mimicry. Psychologist's casuistry. This individual is an expert in the knowledge of men. To what end is he actually studying men? He wants to get some little advantages over them, or even some great advantages. He is a politician. That other individual is also an expert in the knowledge of men, and you say he wants nothing for himself from it. He is one of the grand impersonal ones. Look at him more carefully. Perhaps he even wants a more reprehensible advantage, to feel himself superior to men, to be allowed to look down on them, not to confuse himself with them any longer. This impersonal one is a despiser of men. The former is the more humane species, whatever appearance may indicate. He at least places himself on an equality with men. He places himself among them. The psychological tact of the Germans seems to me to be called into question by a whole series of cases, a list of which my modesty prevents me from bringing forward. In one case there is a remarkable inducement to establish my thesis. I have a grudge against the Germans for having made a mistake about Kant and his backdoor philosophy, as I call it. That was not the type of intellectual honesty. The other thing which I do not like to hear is a notorious and. The Germans say Goethe and Schiller. I'm afraid they will say Schiller and Goethe. Is this Schiller not yet known? There are still worse ands. I have heard with my own ears Schopenhauer and Hartmann. To be sure, only among university professors. The most intellectual men, provided they are the most courageous, experience by far the most painful tragedies, but they reverence life precisely on that account, because it places its most powerful hostile forces in opposition to them. Intellectual conscience. Nothing seems to me to be rarer at present than genuine hypocrisy. I have a strong suspicion that the mild air of our civilization is not beneficial to this plant. Hypocrisy belongs to the ages of strong belief, when people did not part with their own belief, even under the constraint of showing off another belief. At present, people part with it, or, what is more common, they provide themselves with a second belief. In all cases, they remain honest. Undoubtedly, there is at present a very much greater variety of convictions possible than there was formerly. Possible, that is to say, they are permitted, they do no harm. Out of this state of things, tolerance towards oneself originates. Tolerance towards oneself allows several convictions. These live together in agreement. They take care, as everybody does at present, not to compromise themselves. What does one compromise oneself with at present? If one is consistent, if one goes in a straight line, if one is less than ambiguous, if one is genuine. I very much fear that modern man is simply too comfortable for some vices, so that these die out altogether. Everything wicked which is determined by strong will, perhaps there is nothing wicked without strength of will, degenerates to virtue in our lukewarm atmosphere. The few hypocrites I have become acquainted with imitated hypocrisy. They were actors, like almost every 10th man at present. Beautiful and ugly. Nothing is more conditioned, let us say more restricted, than our sense of the beautiful. A person who would try to think of it as detached from man's delight in man would immediately lose his footing. The beautiful in itself is merely an expression, not even a concept. In the beautiful, man sets himself up as the standard of perfection. In select cases, he worships himself in that standard. A species cannot possibly do otherwise than thus to say yes to itself. Its lowest instinct, that of self-maintenance and self-expansion, still radiates in such sublimities. Man believes the world itself to be overcharged with beauty. He forgets that he is the cause of it. He alone has endowed it with beauty, alas, only with very human, all too human beauty. In reality, man mirrors himself in things. He counts everything beautiful which reflects his likeness. The verdict beautiful is man's conceit of his species. A little suspicion may in fact whisper the question into a skeptic's ear. Is the world really made beautiful just because man thinks it is? Man has humanized it, that is all. But nothing whatever warrants us in supposing that it is just man who provides the model of the beautiful. Who knows how he appears in the eyes of a higher judge of taste? Perhaps risky, perhaps even entertaining, perhaps a little arbitrary. "O divine Dionysos, why do you pull my ears?" asked Ariadne once of her philosophic lover, in one of the celebrated dialogues on Naxos. "I find a sort of humour in your ears, Ariadne. Why are they not longer?" Nothing is beautiful except man. All aesthetics rest on this naivete. It is their first truth. Let us straightway add the second. Nothing is ugly except degenerating man. The domain of aesthetic judgment is thereby limited. Re-examined physiologically, all that is ugly weakens and afflicts man. It reminds him of deterioration, of danger, and of impotence. He actually suffers loss of power by it. The effect of ugliness can be measured by the dynamometer. Whenever man is depressed, he has a sense of the proximity of something ugly. His sense of power, his will to power, his courage, his pride, they decrease with the ugly, they increase with the beautiful. In both cases we draw an inference, the premises of which are accumulated in enormous abundance in instinct. The ugly is understood as a sign and symptom of degeneration. Whatever reminds us in the remotest manner of degeneracy prompts us to pronounce the verdict ugly. Every indication of exhaustion, gravity, age, or lassitude, every kind of constraint, such as cramp or paralysis, and above all the odour, the colour, and the likeness of decomposition or putrefaction, though it be utterly attenuated to a symbol, all these things call forth a similar reaction, the evaluation ugly. A hatred then springs up. Whom does man hate there? There can be no doubt, the decline of his type. The hatred is inspired by the most profound instinct of the species. There is horror, foresight, profundity, and far-reaching vision in it. It is the profoundest of all hatreds. On account of it, art is profound. Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer, the last German who comes into consideration, who is a European event, like Goethe, like Hegel, like Heinrich Heine, and not merely a local, a national occurrence, is a case of the first rank for a psychologist, as being an ill-natured, ingenious attempt to bring into the field, in favour of a general nihilistic valuation of the whole of life, the very opposite instances, the grand self-affirmations of will to life, the exuberant forms of life. He has interpreted in turn art, heroism, genius, beauty, grand sympathy, knowledge, will for truth, and tragedy as phenomena resulting from negation, or from the need for negation of will. The most spurious psychological coinage, Christianity excepted, which history records. Looked at more closely, he appears to be merely the heir of Christian interpretation in this. Only he knew how to justify in a Christian sense, that is, in a nihilistic sense, even the great facts of human civilization, which had been repudiated by Christianity, interpreting them as ways leading to salvation, as early forms of salvation, as stimulants for making salvation requisite. I take a single instance. Schopenhauer speaks of beauty with melancholy ardour. What is his ultimate reason for it? Because he sees in it a bridge by which one may get further on, or acquire an incentive to get further on. He regards it as a momentary salvation from will. It allures to everlasting salvation. He especially praises it as the saviour from the focus of will, from sexuality. In beauty, he sees the procreative impulse as negative. Strange saint! Somebody contradicts you, I fear it is nature. For what end at all is there beauty of tone, colour, odour, and rhythmical motion in nature? What creates the display of beauty? Fortunately, a philosopher also contradicts him, no less an authority than divine Plato. Schopenhauer himself calls him divine, maintains another thesis, that all beauty incites to procreation, that this is precisely the proprium of its operation, from its most sensuous up to its most intellectual manifestations. Plato goes further. He says, with an innocence for which one must be Greek and not Christian, that there would be no Platonic philosophy at all were there not such handsome youths in Athens. It was only the sight of them which put the soul of the philosopher into an erotic ecstasy, and gave it no rest until it had implanted the seed of all high things in such a fine soil. A strange saint also. One does not trust one's ears, even if one trusts Plato. At least one surmises that they philosophized differently in Athens, above all that they philosophized publicly. Nothing is less Grecian than the conceptual cobweb spinning of a recluse, intellectual love of God in the manner of Spinoza. Philosophy, according to Plato's mode, could rather be defined as an erotic competition, as a further development and an inward intensification of the old agonal gymnastics with its prerequisites. What ultimately grew out of this philosophical eroticism of Plato? A new technical form of the Grecian agon, dialectics. I further recall, in opposition to Schopenhauer and to the honour of Plato, that the whole of the higher civilization and literature of classical France has also grown up on the soil of sexual interest. One may search everywhere in it for gallantry, sensuality, erotic competition, woman. One will never search in vain. Art for art's sake. The fighting against the purpose in art is always warfare against the moralizing tendency in art, against its subordination to morality. Arts for art's sake, that is, the devil take morality. But this very hostility betrays the domination of the prejudice. When the purpose of the ethical preacher and improver of mankind has been excluded from art, it does not follow at all that art in itself is without a purpose, without a goal, meaningless. In short, arts for art's sake, a serpent which bites its own tail. Rather no purpose at all than a moral purpose. Thus speaks pure passion. A psychologist, on the other hand, asks, what does all art do? Does it not praise? Does it not glorify? Does it not select? Does it not bring into prominence? In each of these cases it strengthens or weakens certain valuations. Is this only a contingent matter, an accident, something with which the instinct of the artist would not at all be concerned? Or rather, is it not the prerequisite which enables the artist to do something? Is his fundamental instinct directed towards art, or is it not rather directed towards the sense of art, namely life, towards a desirableness of life? Art is the great stimulus to life. How could art be understood as purposeless, as aimless, as arts for art's sake? A question still remains. Art also shows up much that is ugly, harsh, and questionable in life. Does it not thereby seem to make life intolerable? In fact, there have been philosophers who gave this meaning to it. Schopenhauer taught that the whole purpose of art is to disengage from will. He honoured it as the great usefulness of tragedy to dispose to resignation. This, however, I have already hinted at it, is a pessimistic perspective, and the evil eye. One must appeal to artists themselves. What of his own personality does the artist communicate to others in tragedy? Is it not precisely the fearless state of mind in presence of the frightful and the questionable which he exhibits? This state of mind is highly desirable in itself. Whoever knows it, honours it with the highest regard. He communicates it. He is obliged to communicate it, provided he is an artist, a genius of communication. Bravery and self-possession in the presence of a powerful enemy, an awful calamity, or a problem which awakens dread, it is this triumphal condition which the tragic artist selects and glorifies. In the presence of tragedy, the martial spirit in us celebrates its Saturnalia. He who is accustomed to affliction, he who seeks affliction, heroic man, extols his existence with tragedy. To him alone the tragic artist offers the draught of this sweetest cruelty. To put up with men, to keep open house with one's heart, that is liberal. But it is no more than liberal. We recognize the hearts which are capable of noble hospitality by the many curtained windows and closed shutters. They keep their best rooms vacant. Why is that? Because they expect guests with whom they do not have to put up. We no longer estimate ourselves sufficiently when we communicate ourselves. Our true experiences are not at all loquacious. They could not communicate themselves, even if they wished. The reason is that they do not have language. We have already got beyond what we can express in words. In all speaking, there is an inkling of contempt. Language, it seems, has only been invented for the average, the middling, and the communicative. With speech, the speaker has already vulgarized himself. Extract from Morals for Deaf Mutes and other philosophers. This likeness is charmingly beautiful. The literary woman, discontented, agitated, desolate in heart and bowels, ever listening with painful curiosity to the imperative which whispers out of the depths of her organism, either children or books. The literary woman, cultured enough to understand the voice of nature even when it speaks in Latin, and, on the other hand, conceited enough and goose enough to speak secretly to herself in French. I shall look at myself, I shall read myself, I shall delight myself, and I shall say, is it really possible that I have had so much wit? The impersonal speak. Nothing comes easier to us than to be wise, patient, and superior. We drip with the oil of forbearance and sympathy. We are just to the verge of folly. We forgive all. For that very reason, we should keep ourselves somewhat more strictly disciplined. For that very reason, we should cultivate in ourselves, from time to time, a little emotion, a little emotional vice. It may be hard for us, and among ourselves we perhaps laugh at the appearance we thus present, but what does it matter? There is no other method available for conquering ourselves. This is our asceticism, our penance. To become personal, the virtue of the impersonal. From a doctorate examination. What is the task of all higher instruction? To make man a machine. What is the means? He has to learn to be tired. How is it attained? By the notion of duty. Who is his model here? The philologist. He teaches how to work laboriously. Who is the perfect man? The government official. What philosophy gives the best formula for the government official? Kant's. The government official as thing in itself, appointed arbiter over the government official as phenomenon, the right to stupidity. The fatigued and slow-breathing working man, who looks good-humoured and lets things take their course, this typical figure whom one meets within all classes of society in this age of labour and of the empire, quite claims art for himself in the present day, including the book and, above all, the journal. How much more to the beauties of nature, to Italy? The man of the evening, with the wild impulses lulled to sleep, of which Faust speaks, requires the health resort, the sea-coast, the glaciers, Bayreuth. In such ages, art has a right to pure folly, as a sort of holiday time for intellect, wit, and humour. That is what Wagner understood. Pure folly is a restorative, another problem of diet. The expedients with which Julius Caesar protected himself from sickness and headache, prodigious marches, the simplest mode of life, uninterrupted living in the open air, and constant military exercise, are, on the whole, the measures for maintenance and protection from extreme liability to injury of that complex machine working under the highest pressure and called genius. The immoralist speaks. There is nothing more distasteful to a philosopher than man when he expresses desires. When the philosopher sees man only in his doings, when he sees this bravest, most artful, and most enduring animal led astray even into labyrinthine states of trouble, how worthy of admiration does man appear to him! The philosopher even provides man with encouragement. But he despises desiring man, desirable man also, and, in general, all desirabilities, all human ideals. If it were possible, a philosopher would be a nihilist, because he finds nothingness behind all human ideals. Or not even nothingness, but only vileness, absurdity, sickness, cowardice, and fatigue, all sorts of dregs out of the drained goblet of his own life. Man, who as a reality is so worthy of reverence, how is it that he deserves no respect in as far as he shows his wishes? Does he have to do penance for being so accomplished as a reality? Does he have to compensate for his activity, for the exertion of thought and will in every activity, by the stretching of his limbs in the imaginary and absurd? The history of his desirabilities has hitherto been the shameful part of man. One must be careful not to read too long in it. What justifies man is his reality. It will forever justify him. How much more worthy is actual man compared with any merely wished, dreamt, or shamelessly falsified man, compared with any ideal man whatsoever? It is only ideal man that is distasteful to the philosopher. Natural value of egoism. Selfishness has as much value as the physiological value of him who possesses it. It may be very valuable, or it may be vile and contemptible. Each individual may be looked at with respect to whether he represents an ascending or a descending line of life. When that has been decided, we have a canon for deciding the value of his selfishness. If he represents the ascent of the line of life, his value is in fact very great, and on account of the collective life which makes a further step in him, the concern about his maintenance, about providing his optimum conditions, may even be extreme. For the single person, the individual, as hitherto understood both popularly and philosophically, is certainly an error. He is nothing by himself, no atom, no link in the chain, nothing merely inherited from former times. He is the embodiment of the one entire line of descent up to himself. If he represents descending development, decay, chronic degeneration, or sickening, diseases, taken on the whole, are phenomena which result from decay already present. They are not the cause of it. He has little worth, and the great fairness would have him take away as little as possible from the well-constituted. He is no more than their parasite, then. Christian and anarchist. When the anarchist, as the mouthpiece of degenerating strata of society, demands justice, righteousness, and equal rights with embellished indignation, he is only under the influence of his lack of civilization, which prevents him understanding why he is actually in trouble. In what respect he is impoverished, that it is in vital vigor that he is impoverished. An impulse to seek for causes is strong in him. It must be somebody's fault that he is in a bad condition. Even embellished indignation itself is pleasant to him. It is an enjoyment for every poor devil to vilify. It gives a taste of the ecstasy of power. Even lamenting and bewailing oneself can give life a charm by which it becomes tolerable. There is a refined dose of revenge in every lament. People reproach those who are different from them for their own bad condition, and under certain circumstances even for their wickedness, as if it were injustice, as if it involved unpermitted privilege. If I be a rogue, you should be one too. It is on the basis of such logic that revolutions arise. Bewailing oneself never does any good. It originates from weakness. Whether a person attributes his bad condition to others or to himself, the socialist does the former, and the Christian, for example, does the latter, it makes no essential difference. What both cases have in common, let us also say, what is unworthy in both cases, is that somebody is to be blamed for the suffering. In short, that the sufferer prescribes for himself the honey of revenge to alleviate his suffering. The objects towards which this need of revenge, as a need of enjoyment, is directed are provided by occasional causes. The sufferer finds causes everywhere, which serve to cool his petty revenge. If he is a Christian, we repeat, he finds the causes in himself. The Christian and the anarchist both are decadents, but, moreover, when the Christian condemns, calumniates, and befouls the world, he does it from the same instinctive motive which impels the socialist working man to condemn, calumniate, and befoul society. Doomsday, even, is the delicious comfort of revenge. Revolution, the same as the socialist working man expects, is merely conceived as somewhat more remote. The other world itself, what would be the use of it if it were not a means for befouling this 35. World? Criticism of decadence morality. An altruistic morality, a morality which causes selfishness to languish, is, under all circumstances, a bad sign. This is true of the individual, it is especially true of peoples. The best is lacking when selfishness begins to be deficient. To choose instinctively what is self-injurious, to be allured by disinterested motives, almost provides the formula for decadence. Not to seek one's own advantage. That is merely the moral fig leaf for quite a different thing, for the physiological fact. One does not know any longer how to find one's own advantage. Disgregation of instincts. When a man becomes altruistic, he is finished. Instead of naively saying, "I am no longer of any account," the moral falsehood in the mouth of the decadent says, "Nothing is of any account. Life is of no account." Such an opinion is ultimately a great danger. It is contagious, soon growing up luxuriantly into a tropical vegetation of ideas on the whole morbid soil of society, at one time as a religion, Christianity, at another time as a philosophy, Schopenhauerism. Under certain circumstances, such poison tree vegetation, grown out of corruption, poisons life with its far-reaching emanations for thousands of years. Morality for physicians. The sick are parasites of society. In certain conditions it is improper to live any longer. The continued vegetating in cowardly dependence on physicians and prescriptions after the meaning of life, the right to life has been lost, should entail the profound contempt of society. The physicians, on the other hand, would have to be agents for communicating this contempt, not recipes for their patients, but every day a new dose of aversion from them. To create a new responsibility, the physician's responsibility, for all cases where the highest interest of life, of ascending life, requires the remorseless crushing down and thrusting aside of degenerating life, for example, for the right to procreation, for the right to be born, for the right to live. To die proudly when it is no longer possible to live proudly. Death selected voluntarily, death at the right time, consummated with brightness and cheerfulness in the midst of children and witnesses, so that an actual leave-taking is possible where he is still present who takes his leave, as well as an actual appraisement of what has been achieved and aspired after, a summing up of life, all in opposition to the pitiable and horrifying comedy which Christianity has practiced with the hour of dying. We must never forgive Christianity for having taken advantage of the weakness of the dying to outrage their consciences, for having misused even the mode of death to arrive at valuations of men and of the past. Here, in spite of all cowardice of prejudice, it is primarily a question of re-establishing the correct evaluation, that is, physiological evaluation, of so-called natural death,
which, in the end, is nothing but an unnatural death, a suicide. One is never destroyed by anyone but oneself. But natural death is a death under the most contemptible conditions. Involuntary death, death at the wrong time, a coward's death. From love of life, we should desire a different kind of death, voluntary, conscious, not accidental or by surprise. Finally, a piece of advice to Messieurs the pessimists and other decadents. We do not have it at our disposal to prevent being born. We can, however, rectify this error, for it is sometimes an error. When someone does away with himself, he does the noblest thing in the world. By so doing, he has almost entitled himself to live. Society, what am I saying, life itself, is more advantaged from this than by any life of renunciation, anemia, or other virtue. One has freed others from one's presence. One has removed an objection to life. Pessimism, pure and raw, only proves itself by the self-refutation of Messieurs the pessimists. One must go a step further with one's logic, and not merely negate life with will and representation, as Schopenhauer did. One must, in the first place, negate Schopenhauer. Pessimism, let us say in passing, notwithstanding its contagiousness, does not, on the whole, increase the infirmity of an age or race. It is the expression of infirmity. One succumbs to it as one succumbs to cholera. One has to be morbidly enough disposed to it. Pessimism itself does not make a single additional decadent. I call to mind the result of the statistics that the years in which cholera rages do not differ from other years in the total number of deaths. Whether we have become more moral. As was to be expected, the whole ferocity of moral stupidity, which avowedly passes for morality itself in Germany, has taken up arms against my concept beyond good and evil. I could tell fine stories about it. My critics, above all, gave me the undeniable superiority of the moral sentiment of our age to reflect upon, the actual progress we have made in this respect. In comparison with us, a Cesare Borgia was on no account to be set up, in the way I did, as a higher man, as a kind of Superman. A Swiss editor, from the Bund, went so far, not without expressing his admiration for the courage of such a hazardous enterprise, as to understand the meaning of my work, to the effect that I proposed to do away with all decent sentiment. Very much obliged. I permit myself, as an answer, to raise the question whether we have really become more moral. That all the world believes it is already an objection against it. We modern men, very delicate, very readily injured, giving and taking consideration in 100 ways, we ourselves imagine, in fact, that this delicate humanity which we exhibit, this realized unanimity in forbearance, in helpfulness and in mutual trust, is positive progress, and that we are far above the men of the Renaissance because of it. Every age, however, thinks in this manner. It is obliged to think thus. It is certain we could not place ourselves in Renaissance conditions. We could not even conceive ourselves placed in them. Our nerves would not stand that reality, not to speak of our muscles. No progress, however, is demonstrated by this incapacity, but only a different, a later condition, weaker, tenderer, and more readily injured, out of which a considerate morality necessarily evolves. If we were to think of our tenderness and lateness, our physiological aging, as absent, our humanizing morality also would straightway lose its value. No morality has value in itself. It would even let us despise it. Let us not doubt, on the other hand, that we modern men, with our thick-padded humanity, which will not by any means strike against a stone, would provide a comedy to the contemporaries of Cesare Borgia to laugh themselves to death over. In fact, we are extraordinarily amusing, though involuntarily, with our modern virtues. The decline of hostile and distrust-awakening instincts, for that would be our progress, represents only one of the consequences in the general decline of vitality. It costs 100 times more pains and more foresight to achieve an existence so conditioned and so late. Under such circumstances, people mutually assist one another. To a certain extent, everybody is sick, and everybody is a nurse. That condition of things is then called virtue. Among men who knew a different mode of life, fuller, more prodigal, more profuse, it would have had a different name. Perhaps cowardice, pitiableness, or old woman's morality. Our softening of manners, that is my thesis, it is, if you like, my innovation, is a consequence of decadence. Severity, frightfulness of manners may, inversely, be a consequence of superabundance of life. For then much can be dared, much can be challenged, and much also can be squandered. What was formerly a seasoning of life would be poison to us. To be indifferent, that also is a form of strength. In the same way we are too old and too late for that. Our morality of sympathy, against which I was the first to give warning, that which one might call l'impressionnisme moral, is a further expression of the physiological over-excitability possessed by all that is decadent. That movement which has attempted to introduce itself scientifically by means of Schopenhauer's morality of sympathy, a very unfortunate attempt, is the true decadence movement in morals, and as such is intrinsically related to Christian morality. Strong eras, noble civilizations, see something contemptible in sympathy, in brotherly love, in the lack of self-assertion and self-reliance. Eras are to be measured by their positive powers. The period of the Renaissance, accordingly, so profuse and fateful, presents itself as the last great period. And we modern men, with our anxious self-nursing and brotherly love, with our virtues of labour, unpretentiousness, fair play, and scientific spirit, accumulating, economic, mechanical, we represent a weak period. Our virtues are determined, are peremptorily called forth by our weakness. Equality, as an actual approximation to similarity, of which the theory of equal rights is only the expression, belongs essentially to decadence. The gap between man and man, between class and class, the multiplicity of types, the will to be oneself, to stand out in contrast, what I call pathos of distance, belongs to every strong period. The tension, the range between the extremes, is always becoming smaller at present. The extremes themselves finally merge into similarity. All our political theories and state constitutions, the German Empire by no means excepted, are consequences, resulting necessities of decadence. The unconscious operation of decadence has gained the ascendancy so far as to affect the ideals of some of the sciences. My objection against the whole of the sociology of England and France is that it only knows decaying types of society by experience, and quite innocently takes its own instincts of decay as the standard for sociological valuations. Deteriorating life, the decline of all organizing power, that is, separating, gap-making, subordinating, and superordinating power, is formulated as the ideal in the sociology of the present day. Our socialists are decadents. Mr. Herbert Spencer, however, is also a decadent. He sees something desirable in the triumph of altruism. My concept of freedom. The value of a thing, lies sometimes not in what one attains with it, but in what one pays for it, what it costs us. I give an example. Liberal institutions immediately cease to be liberal as soon as they are attained. Afterwards, there are no more mischievous or more radical enemies of freedom than liberal institutions. One knows well enough what they accomplish. They undermine the will to power. They are the levelling of mountain and valley exalted into morality. They make people small, cowardly, and voluptuous. With them the herding animal always triumphs. Liberalism, that means increased herding animals. The same institutions produce quite different results as long as they are fought for. They then, in fact, further the cause of freedom in a powerful manner. On looking more accurately, we see that it is warfare which produces these results. Warfare for liberal institutions, which, as war, allows illiberal instincts to continue. And warfare educates for freedom. For what is freedom? To have the will to be responsible for oneself, to keep the distance which separates us, to become more indifferent to hardship, severity, privation, and even to life, to be ready to sacrifice men for one's cause, oneself not excepted. Freedom implies that manly instincts, instincts which delight in war and triumph, dominate over other instincts. For example, over the instincts of happiness. The man who has become free, and how much more the spirit which has become free, treads underfoot the contemptible species of well-being dreamt of by shopkeepers, Christians, cows, women, Englishmen, and other democrats. The free man is a warrior. How is freedom measured, in individuals as well as in nations? By the resistance which has to be overcome, by the effort which it costs to retain superiority. We should have to seek the highest type of free men, where the highest resistance is constantly overcome. 5 paces from tyranny, close to the threshold of the danger of servitude. This is psychologically true, when we mean by tyrants pitiless and frightful instincts, which peremptorily call forth the maximum authority and discipline. The finest example is Julius Caesar. It is also politically true. We only need to look at the course of history. The people who were worth something, who became worth something, never acquired their greatness under liberal institutions. Great danger made something out of them, which deserves reverence. Danger which first teaches us to know our resources, our virtues, our shield and sword, our genius, which compels us to be strong. First principle: men must require strength, otherwise they never attain it. Those great hot houses for the strong, the strongest species of man that has hitherto existed, the aristocratic commonwealths of the pattern of Rome and Venice, understood freedom, precisely in the sense in which I understand the word, as something which one has and has not, as something which one desires, which one wins by conquest.